Welcome everybody. This is the first Open Mic Science for this year. My name is Mike Cox. So just a reminder for those who haven't been to Open Mic Science before, what is this? What we tried to create here is a community. It's a community of dialogue, a community discussion. That's why we're here. That's why we have pizza and beer and whatever you want. It's about sharing science and technology with our community. And as we can see, I think this is kind of popular. So tonight we have the pleasure and the honor of having Dr. Kimball here, Dr. Marie Kimball. She's going to talk about pandemics. It's a very cheery topic. I'm just going to touch on a few things. Her bio is long and very impressive. But I thought a couple things that I highlighted was she was on the technical and strategic lead for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for Surveillance Strategy Formation. She's also a former, are you retired?
Yes.
She's retired. She also was at UW at School of Public Health. And more recently, she was the Rotary President for a year. And if anybody knows anything about Rotary, that was a heck of a lot harder than probably anything else she did. Right?
Yeah.
Fred, where are you?
Fred's right there.
Okay, Fred's the current president of Rotary. This is the Rotary crowd back here. So, yay, Rotary. Anyway, Anna-Marie, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. We're just going to get the logistics sort of set up. I was going to thank all the organizers individually, but he stole my thunder. I would like to thank the organizers, and also I'd like to thank Evelyn Wilder, who's a Rotarian, who helped me format the slides, which was a very, very big help. So I'm retired. I'm a professor emerita from the University of Washington. And you know, when you retire, you get a hobby, right? Bird watching or gardening, which is really wonderful because you're out in nature. I watch germs. And I just want to say that is not really a topic that gets you a lot of invitations on Bainbridge. So I'm delighted to be here. So I wanted to start with what we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, the next agent, the next pathogen, the next pandemic, really nobody knows what's that going to be. So what I'm going to do in this talk is talk a little bit about generally the two that are most topical, which would be M-Pox from West and Central Africa and bird flu, and use those as kind of examples. And then we're going to work into sort of why are we having so many epidemics and pandemics in modern times. And finally, I hope that you have gotten a handout. That is my best effort at assembling the sources of information you can pay attention to in a pandemic, because information is going to be absolutely key. And what we saw during our last pandemic, did anybody remember the last pandemic? Would you raise your hand? Right. What we found was there was a terrific amount of misinformation. So as I say here, the other thing I want to mention is that when we get importation of cases or we get small clusters in the United States, it often portends, that is to say, predicts agents that we need to pay attention to. And for both M-Pox and H5N1, which is bird flu, that's very topical. And finally, I am going to touch on my big worry, which is that we've been told by the incoming administration that they're going to leave WHO on day one. And I did check in with Larry Gostin, who's the head of the Global Law Center. And Larry was very vociferous in the 2020 episode where the president, in the middle of a pandemic, said we were leaving WHO. And he said, oh yes, this was his understanding. He was the one quoted by Associated Press. But we haven't heard it formally from the incoming administration. But meanwhile, everybody over in WHO has been having very high-level meetings. That would be an enormous concern, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm not so sure about the federal level of our country and how useful that will be. I'm just saying. So I wanted to start with this, and the only point of this slide really is to show you that emerging infections, novel infections, are a worldwide problem. So what you see on this slide in red is newly emerging agents, and please don't try and read it. It's sort of an eye chart. But you can see that they're dispersed all over the world, and that's basically the point of the slide. In 1992, Joshua Lederberg, who is was a Nobel laureate geneticist, convened an Institute of Medicine panel. And that panel looked up from their microscopes and away from the clinical bench, and they realized that there were forces that were causing the emergence of brand new agents or the recrudescence of agents like pathogens that we thought were already gone. And these were the factors of emergence that they outlined. And that's going to orient us a little bit. First, population and demographics. So we now have 8 billion people on the earth. Land use changes, international travel and commerce. You know, most bacteria can't swim very well, and yet they come over continents. Technology and industry, the breakdown of public health, microbial adaptation and change, we'll talk just a little bit about that, and climate change and conflict, that is to say, war. So this is historically the history of pandemics going back to the plague of Athens back in 429 BC. And what's the takeaway here is that there may be a huge number of cases for something like influenza. Maybe you don't remember the H1N1 pandemic that we had in 2009, 2010, but you have a huge number of cases, but it was a very mild flu. So this just shows you that historically, we've always had pandemics, but the pace of emergence of new agents seems to be accelerating. So when you look at how this happens, this is actually something I put together for the book. These are the levels of how it happens. So first of all, you have a point of emergence, usually through species jumping. So this is very pertinent for like bird flu, for example. Jumps from a species into humans. That's actually been going on for thousands of years. That's how we got tuberculosis. That's how we got measles, is from animals into humans, which is really a fascinating topic. But then from that point of emergence, you see you get direct contagion and local extension in the secondary phase. And then here you get geographically dispersed, and that's when we call it a pandemic. But over here, you have a mechanism that's very important, which is your trade and travel, which really, you don't only transport what you think you're transporting. Over here, we have your local public health and your national agencies, which are responsible in the first sense when you have a cluster of infections for really preventing that, doing control, trying to make sure it doesn't go to the next level. And then when you get up here, you have the World Health Organization and the World Trade Organization and the multilateral organizations. We have one treaty-based global regimen for controlling pandemics, and those are the International Health Regulations of 2005. Prior to 2005, those regulations only covered plague, cholera, and yellow fever. That was all the countries could agree on. But in 2005, they were opened up, and now they cover a much more broad spectrum of disease. But that's it. There are no other laws that govern how we, as a global community of countries, deal with a pandemic. And that's important. So I'm going to talk just a little bit, because not everybody in the room is probably a microbiologist or a virologist, about what we know about the life cycle of a virus. And we're going to focus on viruses because that's the most likely pandemic agent, and that's what we've been seeing. So viral replication, basically a virus is a genome wrapped in a protein coat. And it attaches at a particular site on a cell, injects itself into the cell, and takes over the cell machinery. and then replicates itself within the cell. We have two kinds of viruses. We have a DNA virus, which would be like monkeypox, and an RNA virus, which is like flu. The difference between the two is that DNA is really stable. It's your double helix, right? RNA is only a single strand. And so when that replicates, it's much more likely to have mutation and change. But basically, they take over a cell, and then they replicate themselves. And I wanted to share with you some numbers about how many of those little guys get out when they burst the cell, right? So it's between 500 and 40,000, depending on which cell has been invaded, depending on which agent. So this is a very proliferating process. So when it gets in your body, when it gets in your lungs, it goes like that. And then your body reacts immunologically, and that's often why you get organ failure. It's not so much from the virus, but from how your body is trying to fight the virus. So let's talk about our two case studies and why on earth we picked them. First of all, they're famous right now, and so I felt it was good that we could really all understand them. So both agents have global spread through trade and travel, both M-Pox and bird flu. M-Pox is a fake public health emergency of international concern. Remember I told you about the international health regulations? That's the Bible for how they decide if it's a public health emergency of international concern at the global level. And there have been very few of these declarations, but M-Pox was declared both in 2020 and 2024. Both have vaccines that protect against them, and both came from animals. So let's talk about M-Pox. This is actually very interesting if you're a germ watcher like me. If you're not, you'll just have to put up with it. But M-Pox was first described in 1970, but it wasn't described in West or Central Africa. It was described in laboratory monkeys that were exported to Europe. And that's how they first found M-Pox, which used to be called monkeypox. Now, you'll probably remember that we successfully eradicated smallpox by 1979. And that smallpox vaccine also was effective for M-Pox. So we didn't see much M-Pox because the whole world basically had been vaccinated. It started in Central Africa. It's a very stable virus, but it's already from one ancestor developed two different clades, we call them. So it's basically from a common ancestor, two different kinds of viruses. And within the clades, there's more divisions, and the taxonomy of virology will put you to sleep, I guarantee. But the clade 2 outbreak started in 2022, and you may have heard about it. It was basically starting in West Africa, and then it spread to Europe, and it spread to the United States. Now there's been over 100,000 cases. And the transmission seemed to be primarily in gay and bisexual men internationally. And then we saw the emergence of clade 1, and that seems quite a bit more dangerous, which is why you're hearing a lot more about it. And that's very centralized in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The problem with monkeypox is that it's in areas where there's very poor sanitation and very high poverty. So even though in 2022 they began working and developed a vaccine that was successful against it, that got there in November of 2024 to DRC. The reason they couldn't vaccinate earlier was because the smallpox vaccine, if you give it to somebody with HIV, which is immunosuppression, it will give them a very serious illness because it replicates. So they had to develop a non-replicating vaccine. So here's the global situation of the current spread, and you can see it's really gone everywhere. So the darker one is clade 1. So you see it, this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's also in Rwanda, CAR, and Burundi. And this is clade 2, which has been imported into a number of areas and has a large number of cases globally. But this isn't the first rodeo for M-Pox. And this was a fascinating story because M-Pox suddenly showed up in 2003 in the United States. And it showed up across the Midwest in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, etc. And the CDC was called to go do an epidemic investigation, which are really fun, I've got to say. And they went in and they did a case control, and they found that the people who had M-Pox were keeping pet prairie dogs. I don't know if I can say that, pet prairie dogs. So they went back and said, where did the prairie dogs, the pet prairie dogs in the Midwest, how did they come up with M-Pox? And it turned out that they had been imported by an exotic animal importation in Illinois, and they'd been housed with another animal that was imported from West Africa, which was the giant pouched rat. Now, I don't know about you guys, but quarantine was started in the 14th century to prevent rats from one place getting off ships and creating plague in the other. And yet here we have an industry that's importing the largest rat in the world into the United States. But that was the case, and that's how the prairie dogs got the pox. Fortunately, there were no deaths. The other part about this rat is that it's now become invasive in Florida, where people have let them out. So now to shift a little bit, we'll talk about influenza. We are in the middle of influenza season right now. Last season, we only lost about 28,000 people in the United States. Flu always comes through and causes a very high number of doctor visits, high number of hospitalizations. The reason that seasonal flu is so concerning in this setting is because, like I said, it's a single RNA virus, right? So if it got co-infected with another single RNA virus, i.e. the bird flu virus, they could swap genes really easily. And that's why everybody's so concerned right now about human transmission. But we look at the southern hemisphere to understand what our flu season is going to look like. And their flu season was relatively mild and had the usual pattern in children and elderly. And our formulation of the influenza vaccine, which is done every year by WHO, has the appropriate strains to protect us this season. Doesn't mean it's going to be 100%, but that's the good news. So this is the current seasonal flu data from CDC this week. You can see where transmission is highest in our friends in Oregon, and we're the red. And these are just the positive samples to show you the curve. Please don't pay any attention to the numbers, but we are at the peak of influenza season as we speak. So what's the current status of bird flu? Well, bird flu, first of all, I want to make it very clear, it's also called highly pathogenic avian influenza. It's also called H5N1. Okay, the H is for one site on the flu virus. The N is for another site. All the viruses in the flu family have an H and an N. The avian is H5. Humans are H3N2. And H1N1 was from pigs, okay? So basically, bird flu's been around for a while. We'll talk a little bit about that. Its transmission is from birds. Birds don't really have a large die-off with this, and many birds carry it all the time. So it's a zoonotic infection. It's in the birds. But something happened in March of 2024 that hadn't happened before. Now, they had already seen sea lions in Peru dying off of bird flu, and they've seen seals, but we found a cow they found a cow in Texas. And what happens in cows is they look listless, they're just not being cows, and they don't give milk very well. So Texas had an outbreak on one ranch, and all they had to do was stop animal movement. But the commissioner in Texas decided that the money was more important, and so the animals went out, and now we've got it in 18 states and more than 800 herds, including our state. So, but California has really been hit hard. So you've got cows now, who are mammals, with H5N1, and they're in close proximity with humans, of course. And the problem also has been that people who work farms often don't want to be connected to the government because they may be here illegally. Farmers don't want the government on their farms. USDA had to work with CDC. That's even probably more difficult. So basically, our control has not been 100%. Meanwhile, the bird flu in poultry has also been all over the place. In southeast Washington, there was a farm of 800,000 birds that were culled because of H5N1. And again, the people who go and euthanize those flocks of chickens, those are usually farm workers who are often indigent folk and maybe illegals, and certainly don't want anything to do with the government. So this is a very complicated thing to fix. And what do you notice? I hope you've noticed that your egg prices have really gone up. But that's why everyone's so concerned about this particular influenza virus. But again, it's not the first rodeo for H5N1. And I think I really need to emphasize this. We had this in Asia Pacific back in 1996 is the first isolation, and that was from China, Guangdong province, in a bird. And then we had a human outbreak in 1997 that completely turned influenza understanding on its head. Because we always thought that influenza had to go through the pig to get from animal to human, because all our other influenza pandemics had been from the pig. But yet we had a cluster in 1997 in Hong Kong of 18 cases in school children, and the transmission was from birds directly. And everybody went, oh no. And we had a 33% mortality in that cluster, which is very high. And so this is some information from the subsequent outbreak, which was in Southeast Asia and throughout Malaysia, Myanmar. And I guess what I want to emphasize here is there were a large number of deaths. And especially in Indonesia, they had 115 deaths out of 140 cases. There were major culling of flocks, 63 million in Thailand. Oh, and one other thing. The thing that people always wonder is, well, why do you kill the chickens? Why do you have to kill the chickens, right? It's because chickens cannot be shipped internationally if they've been vaccinated. And so in Vietnam, where they don't have a big chicken trade and they don't export, they are able to go ahead and vaccinate their flocks. In the United States, on the other hand, we put a trade embargo against the French when they started vaccinating their ducks. So that's a big disincentive for vaccinating the birds. So I'm going to show you just, I hope, I have a clip here I'd like to show you just to emphasize a couple of things. When I was at the University of Washington, we worked with the Asia Pacific Economic Alliance to look at emerging infections, set up a network. We worked with them for about a decade plus. We were funded by state, we were funded by CDC, and we were funded by APEC.
We all know that the epicenter can be anywhere. It can be inside your own country or come from outside.
Mainly we're concerned about oil and gas, because without oil and gas our economy will falter.
As you may see here, we have made a significant progress in emergency preparedness. We are about at 57% of our goal.
On the evening of May 29, 2008 in the Americas, and the morning of May 30th in Asia, representatives of 17 APEC economies participated in a virtual symposium. Linked via high-speed research and education networks, they met to exchange information on a subject vital to all: preparation for an influenza pandemic.
Tonight we bring together the efforts of our public health sector partners and their work with their private sector partners.
With state-of-the-art support from Pacific Northwest Gigapop, providing highest-speed internet access, participants met for a dynamic discussion without leaving their own countries.
I think it's really quite amazing to have people talk to one another across a number of time zones. For example, we were talking and participating on a Wednesday evening, and others were participating on a Thursday morning. Are there any economies that have any questions that they would like to pose to Canada?
In this second EINET virtual symposium, hosted by the University of Washington in Seattle, the focus was on cooperation between each country's public and private sectors. The partnership is key in preparing for a flu pandemic.
We learned this from SARS. The cities of Beijing and Hong Kong and Singapore were virtually shut down during the epidemic, and there were great economic losses. Many businesses went bankrupt. A lot of services were disrupted, and that was a relatively small outbreak. In the case of pandemic influenza, these could become quite large, involving millions and millions of people in cities throughout the world, disrupting the food supply system, power grids, fuel supplies. Everything could be affected by such a pandemic.
Absenteeism for critical support. How do we prepare for that?
A future pandemic will spread quickly.
It was very remarkable with SARS to watch how quickly, from one focus of an individual who spread a lot of infection in Hong Kong at the time, to virtually 19 countries from that single exposure. So this is a very real threat. I think we learned a very big lesson with SARS. The estimates are upwards of $30 billion of economic loss, not to mention the loss of human life. It will be much more profound with flu.
Dr. Kimball, do you have a question?
I have a quick question. No one's going to go to a website and read a 300-page pandemic preparedness plan in a different language. But they are going to sit around a table and really share what their plans are. And it's really important to know, as we saw in SARS. You have to know what Singapore is going to do. If Singapore is your major trading and travel partner and you're China, you need to know what China is going to do if you're Washington State. So this way you can get an understanding of what intention is and what planning is and how far along the economies are in their own planning process. That's enough of that. What I wanted you to appreciate, though, is that the level of cooperation when we were talking trade, when we were talking economics, was extraordinary. And frankly, if you want to get countries to pay attention to pandemics and infectious diseases, you got to bring the money in. That's just the reality of how it works. So I wanted to show you this, which is bird flu impact last year on some economies on their poultry meat export. And so Turkey, Argentina, and Chile, and I won't go through the numbers, those are in tons. But basically, you need that information if you're dealing with policymakers to get policies through that will protect humans. And that always really kind of was distressing to me because I'm very idealistic. And I thought, gee whiz, if people are dying, that should be the most important thing. Anyway, moving right along. So why do we have this increased threat of pandemics? Basically, if we had much more proactive prevention when we get those first importations, we wouldn't have so much of a problem. But we're really relying on nation states. Many of them are under-resourced. And so it's a very fragile framework that we're dealing with. This is our global population. And I just wanted to emphasize that 8 billion people are now on the planet, and the planet hasn't changed. I mean, the landmass on the planet hasn't changed. I used to explain to my students that the People's Republic of China has 1.4 billion people, and we have 340 million, and they have 40% of the arable land that we have. So it's not surprising that they've become sort of a hotbed for new infections. And then there's this. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Remember, I told you that's where monkeypox, M-Pox, as we now call it, has been really wreaking havoc in eastern Congo. And this is from Kivu, and this is basically a product of conflict as people move in without proper sanitation or proper water. So we're creating our own problems that are causing this increased emergence of infection. I wanted to talk a little bit about current air passenger and air freight. I won't go into the numbers here, but they're enormous. This is from IATA, just showing you that basically air passenger travel has increased back to where it was pre-pandemic. Air freight has also done so, which is great news for business, but not so good for pandemic control. Because on an airplane, you can get on being completely asymptomatic because your travel is going to be a matter of hours. However, your disease incubation period is 7 to 21 days, depending on the disease. So then you get sick when you arrive. And that was a real problem with COVID. Basically, travel restriction doesn't work very well for this particular problem. And then sea cargo, where we also saw that the crews often fly under flags that are not their own, and we had crews that were lost at sea for months and months and months, not accepted at any port, nobody taking responsibility. And also the shipping in shipping containers makes it very hard to ascertain what's in the cargo. The good news is we do have great diagnostics for both of these agents. The bad news is we don't have point of care diagnostics for either of these agents, and that's what you really want. You really want to go to the doctor and have them be able to say, this is not bird flu. But right now all the bird flu samples go to CDC. We also have vaccines, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. We have good vaccines for seasonal influenza. We have H5 vaccines, which are based on the older strains, and we have a stockpile of 4.8 million at this point. The problem becomes, how do you deploy all of these resources into a population rapidly enough? And that's basically what we saw didn't work so well with COVID. We also have therapies, of course. We have antiviral therapies. And the current advice is please don't stockpile Tamiflu. We're not yet in a bird flu crisis. But you know, if you look at how COVID impacted our population, I think we've really learned some important things, and I'm going to wind up really quickly. But one of the things was the amount of misinformation, especially about the vaccine, and created a real vaccine skepticism. So we're seeing vaccine levels fall in our country for diseases like measles and diseases like polio. We haven't seen these diseases, especially measles, now we're seeing again. We hope we aren't ever going to see polio again. But every single vaccine preventable disease is at risk now because people don't trust the vaccines. And they don't trust the institutions because of all the misinformation that's gone around. They don't trust doctors, which has been really uncomfortable. But the factors of emergence are still with us. And as I said before, they're only ramping up. They're not ramping down. We really need to get serious about collaboration. One of the reasons I showed you the APEC clip, which mercifully we didn't have to go all the way through, was because you really need to create strong international collaboration around these issues. So calling something a China virus, that ends your cooperation with the People's Republic of China. You know, trying to point fingers that this came from your economy and you're at fault, that really isn't the way that you build those bridges that you want for sharing information, sharing samples, and sharing policies across borders. With the demise of, if we leave WHO, that will become even more acute. The other thing that we're really not prepared for, and I wanted to take a little time about Kitsap County, is we really hollowed out our public health over the last decades. There's more than 3,000 local and state health departments in the country, but they've lost about 40% of their budget over the last decade. So we have underfunded local health, which is going to be at the front line, probably even more so. And then we're all aware of the health emergency that was declared 2 years ago in this county because we have a lack of access to primary care and to care in general. This is not news to us, but what that means is when we have a pandemic or even an epidemic, we're going to be really swamped, and it's going to be very, very difficult. So that's why it's urgent, and we need to really pay attention and take care of these problems. This is vaccine hesitancy. When I served on the COVID-19 task force for Rotary International, it was really impressive because we had this vaccine that really was effective, and our country and Russia were the two where there was the most vaccine hesitancy. Not company you'd like to keep. And all the other countries were just delighted to finally have this vaccine. So basically what I wanted to emphasize in this talk is that we may not have the federal level, we may be leaving the global level. The risk of pandemics continues. We have a couple of good candidates, especially with bird flu. I'll be happy to answer any questions, but my purpose here was really to say, you guys, I want you to know where your information is going to come from if you have a pandemic or an epidemic, who you're going to trust, because I think that's going to be central to how we move forward. The sheets that I handed out are my best references for who you should listen to in the government and in the non-governmental, and all those websites are there, the new policies are there, the new papers are there. If you really need to go to sleep tonight, start reading a WHO policy. But I think that's going to be absolutely central. So that's my purpose in talking to you tonight, to explain to you the risk and also hopefully to give you some tools. So with that, this is our local health department. And this is Gib Morrow, who is our health officer. We have one of the best, and Gib Morrow is one of the best. And I would highly recommend getting to know our local health department. And we also have community groups. Rotary's been working on health access over the last 2 years, but we also have Bainbridge Prepares, because preparedness for major disasters is very similar to preparedness for influenza and pandemics. We have the Medical Reserve Corps. We have the Bainbridge Community Foundation, which just gave a grant for primary health care on the island. So, and they all welcome volunteers and members if you want to get more involved. So in summary, I think I've already summarized. What I'd like to hear from you is your questions, comments, critiques, and please don't diss that bad clip. Are there any questions or thoughts? Okay.
Could you stand up?
Yeah.
Stand up because it's hard to hear. Then we can
So why are we not? What's the deal with the vaccines of chickens that we can't bring them into the country if they're vaccinated? That doesn't make any sense.
It's a trade policy. Why can't we trade vaccinated chickens? Well, because it's part of it's not really, but there's a regulation under WTO, there's a regimen called the sanitary phytosanitary regulations, right? And countries use that to stop trade. So they go and they say, I'm not bringing ducks in from France because they're vaccinating their ducks. And that holds with WTO on the basis that our country made the argument that could mask bird flu and we might import bird flu. Well, but now we're in kind of a different situation. And I haven't gone back to see if they're letting those ducks in. But it would be sort of silly to be afraid of importing bird flu when we've got it in 800 herds of cows and all over our poultry. So
What has triggered in the past administrations the decline in public health funding?
What has triggered the decline in past administrations, to the public health funding? That's a very good question. You know, it's kind of like the fairies, right? I say that because if it's not broke, nobody wants to fix it. Public health is even more so. I mean, if we prevent disease, it doesn't happen. And so the next time the ledge meets, they'll take a look and say, oh, well, we don't have a problem with that anymore. So we can cut their funding. And I think that's a general problem with preventive medicine, but I also think what you see is there's a tendency to kick the can down the road when you need repeated support for public services. And I think that's really concerning.
Can we blame the large industries in healthcare now?
Can we blame the large industry? You can certainly do that. The consolidation of healthcare is a huge problem that started before COVID. And one thing Gib is doing in our county is he has a work group of all the major providers of healthcare in Kitsap that has started last July. And so they're trying to figure out how to improve access. It is very difficult because the corporate structure of hospital consortia does not actually foster local decision making. So I'm gonna stay pretty mild on that. But yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem.
Thank you.
What about RSV? You didn't mention it.
I didn't mention it. RSV, we are also at the peak. See, we're at the peak respiratory season, and so that could be flu, and it's definitely RSV. RSV is much less of a concern because it has less reassortment potential with seasonal flu, which we're also at the top of. There's also a big rise in human metapneumovirus, which is in China, and India is very concerned about it. Again, it's a virus we know, and it's a virus that's mild. RSV, of course, can be quite serious in the elderly, but yeah, that's why. It just doesn't resort with seasonal flu that easy. Yeah.
How much cooperation do you think is there between the United States and China on some of these issues, public health issues, your experience?
Well,
Could you repeat that question?
sure. How much cooperation is there between the United States and China on these issues? What you saw with China, okay, there had been very poor cooperation with SARS because SARS happened before the People's Congress, and so all the way up the chain, it was very political in China. You don't give bad news before the People's Congress. So they got a lot of criticism for that from neighboring countries, especially from Hong Kong, which wasn't part of them at that point. So this time, they actually got the genome up in a month after they say the cluster happened. And but they haven't been transparent as they need to be with the strains. Calling it the China virus sort of shut down any cooperation because the other part, having been to China many times, is they have they're very sensitive, proud people, and saying something like that, you know, is a loss of face, and that's the end of your relationship, basically. So I can't say right now, but we used to have a lot of cooperation. They still share strains with WHO and around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for the good information on what people can do locally, go bags and get vaccinated and so forth. Very important. Do you have any ideas about what ordinary citizens can do at a higher level of impact? Because many of the things you've mentioned seem to be sort of institutional problems or industrial problems with big companies and so forth. And do you have any awareness, any motion that's going on at that level that citizens can be involved in?
Citizens can definitely be involved in all the community groups that work on preparedness. Citizens can be involved in supporting their local health department. Citizens can be involved in advocating with their congresspeople about leaving WHO and perhaps about having a Secretary of HHS who's a bit of a skeptic on vaccines. And you can advocate definitely with the state ledge. I mean, the budget has just gone through for the state legislature, and make sure public health doesn't get a cut, you know, and that they get augmented.
Is that in your handout sheet?
What, how do you reach the state legislature?
No, all the options you just went through.
No.
There are a large number of people on Bainbridge and other places that feel relatively limited in what impact they can have on larger problems. I mean, things you mentioned just now are good. They would be good on your sheet, I think.
Well, I think they were on my last slide. Let's see.
Maybe they are. I don't.
Yeah, I didn't read the whole slide. This is all the stuff you can do. Get your vaccination. Support local public health. Federal and international level are going to be muted, so you've got to really work on that. Social media, I'm really worried about because they were the major, it's interesting, they're the major fountain of news information for the American public.
Blue Sky?
And Blue Sky is a great option. X, I would get off, and I don't know what's going to happen with no fact checking. I mean, it's just, it's just crazy. Just know it's not reliable, and so when people come to you and say, this is what I heard on X, you go, fine. But yeah, I think mostly working locally and with state level is, and I would really support the process that Kitsap County is going through in trying to look at the care delivery issues.
Just in terms of the surveillance systems, international surveillance and detection systems, have they improved since COVID?
The international surveillance systems have, and I should mention, because a Bainbridger is in charge of it, there is a new initiative at WHO to do exactly what we talked about in the first sense, which is when there's a cluster or there's an outbreak, go early and help and do technical advice and bring materials, etc. So the Global Health Emergency Corps is being put together by Dr. Scott Dowell, who lives on the north end of our island but is right now in Geneva, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That should help with that early intervention. Strain sharing is going on. Countries share reports. Most of that's regionalized. So, you know, you have 6 regions. We have the Americas, we have Europe, we have Africa, we have Southeast Asia. So regionally, I think those systems are working. What's really helped has been digital transmission. And another problem for Africa is that they're just breaking out of a lot of monopolies of telecoms, which have really held them back. Yeah.
So I got a question about COVID. It seems like it's pretty much in the rearview mirror, but I mean, we're still getting vaccines, vaccinated, and what do you see as the future in the next couple
That's really an interesting question. So his question was, what about COVID? And I was just reading today in the respiratory disease alerts that are on your list. Yeah, COVID's still very much with us, but it's not seasonalized very much. So it's high right now, but it was also high in the summer. It's not as high as they thought it would get because people had immunity from the summer, and a fair number of people got immunized. What's going to happen with COVID is it's going to settle back into being an endemic seasonal infection. We're not seeing nearly the mortality that we saw with the first strains, you know, the alpha strain in particular. And when it first hit us, I mean, people would go to the emergency room with flu-like symptoms, you know, take 2 aspirin and a lot of fluids and go home and you'll be fine. And 8 days later, they would come back hypoxemic and on the verge of death. So that was almost impossible for our clinicians to manage. And then you had spread within the hospitals and you had risk for everybody because nobody had any immunity. And I just can't say enough about the bravery and courage of the people who took care of folks all the way through COVID. And that's why some of this misinformation is just so extremely hurtful.
So do you see it being added to our suite of shots every year, like a flu shot?
I think That'll be interesting to see. I get them, and I get boosters. I'm going to continue to get boosters until it has a nice seasonal pattern that I can predict and not get a shot until October. Any other questions? Yeah, back there.
Is there anything like adequate monitoring of the presence of diseases like we're talking about in wildlife? For example, we have millions of birds
Yeah.
that come to
Right.
this area, and a lot of them are killed. Are any of them tested?
Is there anything like a wildlife monitoring? It's difficult. It's difficult. What you see, and I'm not a wildlife biologist, but what they see is they see a certain die-off, and then they go and test, and then they find bird flu. But they can't possibly test every single bird. And what happens is the birds get it into the poultry, and the poultry in intensive poultry agriculture have 18 inches that they live their whole life in. They're very, very close. And so it goes into one chicken, and the whole chicken thing gets it, right? And that's kind of the same with the cows. So it's all coming from the birds, but monitoring the birds is very difficult, is what I understand. So no, basically, I don't think anyone's really figured out how to adequately monitor, except when it comes into mammals or other species, or you see a big die-off. Yeah.
So how does it get from a bird to a cow?
Good question. How does it get from a bird to a cow? And the answer, they believe, is that wild birds fly over the barnyards where the cows are, and they drop, and the bird poop, right, and yeah, that's how it gets into the cows and how it gets into the poultry.
So they eat accidentally gets the bird poop.
I don't think it's on purpose. No, it's not just touching it. Yeah, they're eating it. Yeah, and I should also mention that one of the highest concentrations of H5N1 in infected cows is in their milk. And we just have about half the states testing prior to pasteurization raw milk. Do not drink raw milk, no matter what. Okay, any other? Yeah.
They've been doing some testing on sewage to figure out spread of viruses. Is that still ongoing?
Yes, he's asking about sewage surveillance. This is fascinating. It's a whole different talk, but sewage surveillance started with cholera probably 3 decades ago, and we use it in polio all the time, where you go into the sewage and you you take some sewage and you test it for the virus you're interested in. We use it all over the world for the polio program, and they are using it for these pathogens. I don't think they're using it for monkeypox. They're definitely using it for COVID, because it came in a big way in COVID. I've read papers that they have the technology to do it for bird flu. I just don't know if it's being done routinely. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Next door neighbor about accessibility to healthcare, and we're in a crisis right here on Bainbridge, Kitsap County in general, but